Thank you, Jeremy, for this fantastic introduction. We're humbled by what you said. Going to the presentation, let's see, do I click just this?
The arrow to the side.
Okay, here we go. Jay and I have been working on research on ethnic entrepreneurship. So probably in the last 5 years, I would say 2010 we started. And yes, it's a challenge when you work with somebody from another college. This is what we call in academia interdisciplinary research, which takes a lot of time, but it's very rewarding, and the results are very rewarding as well. It started because both of us were interested in business success stories in Wichita. The more unusual, the better. So we started chatting about it, and that's how our first project got to be, based on some discussions. So the youth of the state is becoming much more rapidly Asian and Hispanic. That's a quote by John Logan, who is a sociology professor at Brown University and the director of the 2010 census data. So the state here being Kansas. So he was quoted in an article as saying, the youth in Kansas are becoming more Hispanic and Asian. So we thought this is a powerful statement to start with and talk about ethnic entrepreneurship. But first I want to give you some statistics. Working with Jay, you're going to see the difference in the slides, okay? So we've seen charts and we've seen data, and all that is fantastic because it allows us to see data-driven ideas and insights into entrepreneurship. But working with a historian, we have more of stories to tell you. So we don't have data. You're not going to see one chart in our presentation. So Chris covered it all, and Bob covered it all. But it's a very valuable data. It's qualitative data. It takes more time to collect, but then it's very rich. So I cheated, and I put the data in my notes, okay? So you're going to get some data. Based on the 2010 census, this article came after the 2010 census, the Kansas population grew 6% from 2000 to 2010. The census is done every 10 years. Here's the thing. Even though the population grew 6%, the number of non-Hispanic whites went down. And the number of Hispanics went up by about 60%, and Asian by about 45%. So that's powerful. So the growth in population didn't come from non-Hispanic whites. However, when they looked at the populations between 18 years old and 24 years old, there was a slight uptick for the non-Hispanic whites, and that explains why now they're youth, but the aging population is not being replaced. So for Wichita, the non-Hispanic whites, like I said, for Wichita, went down. Blacks remained the same, and the Hispanic doubled in size, and the Asian went up 33%. So we look at Kansas, and we look at Wichita in particular, and we see that the economic landscape is changing, right? So this is a big population that has consumer buying, you know, the consumer buying power from the population itself. Plus, there is the correlation between the greater the number of the population, the more the businesses. So as of 2010, there were about 800 Hispanic businesses. Half of them were between 1 and 4 employees. So they were not sole proprietorship or single. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Jay to talk about some slides.
Thank you very much, Sue. Well, again, really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. It is a little odd as a historian to be here at an economic conference, especially one that talks about the future, but there is a basis in this. When I came to Wichita State, I was a colleague of Craig Minor, who was the business historian of Kansas. And over the years, I have learned with interactions with people like Sue, with my colleagues like Robert Weems and others, that you can't get too far into the local story and not deal with entrepreneurship and not deal with business. And so if you look at the Wichita story, traditionally our story of entrepreneurship hinges on a couple of big themes, whether it's Pizza Hut on the upper left. The structure in the center, that was the place where A.A. Hyde and the Yucca Soap Company developed mentholatum. You look at the oil industry in the upper right. These are folks on the Varner farm outside of Augusta in the late 19-teens. That set the stage for us being the air capital. The little emblem there was a promotional emblem created in 1927 that you could put on the front of your car to show how proud you are of Wichita being the air capital. And then last we have the discussion of the cattle trade and being on the Chisholm Trail, the 150th anniversary of which is next year. But again, we're tied to a number of major stories. However, hidden in plain sight are other entrepreneurship stories of different groups and different populations that teach us different lessons. We have, right from the beginning of our community, we were founded with the help of people like Wilhelm Greifenstein, an immigrant from Germany. This location was basically Greifenstein's farm. You have a very rich African-American story that goes right back to the very founding of our city. Did you know that one of the signers of the incorporation documents for our city was an African-American? It's a side we don't think about. We have a Jewish presence that has gone back to the 1870s and 1880s. At Douglas and Main, 3 of the 4 businesses in the late 1870s were Jewish-owned, including the New York store. The Hayes brothers were not very far away. Banks, retails, and so forth were very much part of this. Later on, we're going to see a rich tradition in oil, scrap, and a whole host of different industries. Sue and I got together working on a project looking at the Lebanese community, or Syrians as they called themselves then. It was a community that started as peddlers and then grocers, moved into developing things such as the hotel supply industry. One of the families, the Ablas, created the small portable diner that will later be known as the Valentine Diner. We notice a very strong Latino or Hispanic presence that goes right back to the 19-teens. And there's a story that we're working on right now. In fact, we're working together on a story looking at ethnic businesses on Broadway, looking at Latino and Asian businesses. The Asian presence goes back, whether it's Chinese and Japanese in the turn of the century, whether it's Southeast Asian since the 1970s. There has been a very strong story here. But that it's not just related to the groups that we tend to think of as ethnic or minority groups. We have young women being part of the mix in a variety of ways. Native American, and the Native American presence has been there since the 1870s and still continues. It doesn't end. But then we think about other groups. The LBGT community is its own group with its own dynamics in entrepreneurship. The disability community is, whether you're talking about sight, hearing, and mobility, are also very much part of the entrepreneurship story with their own dynamics and their own issues. International, we tend to think of groups as either domestic or immigrant, but if you're talking about someone who is, say, a motel owner who is from Gujarat, they don't think of themselves as immigrant. They think of themselves as part of a global network that includes family and other connections to India, to Britain, and elsewhere. And then we have regional groups. Southern groups, for example, have their own connections and identities. And we could talk about other cultural groups, the Mennonites, for example. The LDS, the Mormons, have their own traditions. And then even other subcultures as well have their own dynamics. I've been working on a project looking at rock bands in Wichita, and a number of those guys who had really long wild hair in the 70s go on to found companies in sound and recording here in Wichita. But all of these are parts of the story that we often don't realize. But to get that, we have to understand that it's not one story. There are many stories. And towards that, I want to turn it back over to Sue to help us with some terms.
Okay, so we heard some of these terms, but I want to go over them again. Ethnic entrepreneurship is different than immigrant entrepreneurship, different than minority entrepreneurship. So these three key terms are out there. So let's look at ethnic entrepreneur. What makes an ethnic entrepreneur? Somebody who shares with a bigger community the national background. They come from the same place or same migration experience. That would be an ethnic entrepreneur. An immigrant entrepreneur is a more recent arrival, someone that migrated recently to the States or another place and starts a business as means of surviving. That's an immigrant entrepreneur. The minority entrepreneurs, like we said, could be women, Black, Hispanic, according to what the US federal categories have them in. So we have ethnic, immigrant, minority, and then we touched with when Chris presented about necessity and opportunity entrepreneurs. What's the difference between them? And this term, by the way, started in 1980, necessity versus opportunity, but became more popular with GEM. GEM is the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And every year they do a survey of all the countries. The USA is one of them. And right now I'm working on a sub-project here looking at the last 11 years. They have the data on the website, and they come up with a huge report. It's out of Babson College, researchers at Babson College. But every country selects its own group of researchers that is going to analyze the data that comes out. And it's amazing. If you have not heard about it or seen it, I encourage everyone to go to GEM. Just Google GEM and you'll find it. So when they started tracking necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurs, now everybody's talking about it. Necessity is when you're forced to go and start a business. When you exhaust all your options, you're trying to find a job and you don't get it, just because you're an immigrant or for whatever reason, that makes it a necessity entrepreneur. Opportunity is more, you're very good at identifying the opportunity out there in the market. So you find a niche, you find something missing, and you go after it. It's in you to be an entrepreneur and look for the next opportunity. So, and then while doing some research, I came across a couple of reports which are very interesting. One is called the New Fortune 500. The New Fortune 500. I don't know how many of you, and this is because Fortune rates the companies every single year based on revenue. How many of you know that 40% of the 2010 Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants? 40%. Okay. They employ more than 10 million people, those companies, those 40% of the Fortune 500. And the revenue generated by these 40% of the companies is greater than the GDP, the gross domestic product of the US, Japan, and China. So that's pretty amazing. I was surprised. And 7 of the 10 most valuable brands that we know of in the States, one of the founders was also an immigrant. And they name Apple, Google, AT&T, Budweiser, Colgate, eBay, General Electric, IBM, and McDonald's. And that's just to name a few. They have a great appendix there, I think 6 pages, listing all the companies and where the immigrant was from. So let's look at the issues, themes, and findings, ethnic entrepreneurs. This was I'm going to use the example of the Lebanese because like Jay said, We did talk about our first project. Let's look at this Lebanese community. You walk around. This is when I came to Wichita, I saw all these names, Farha and Jabara. I visited WSU, and there's the Abla Library and Jabara Hall. And so I was interested, I was curious, and we got to do the first project. We interviewed individuals from the big families here. So Farha, Jabara, Kolmia, Stevens, lengthy interviews which we recorded and then put together in an article. So what we found out is that the Lebanese came to Wichita, Kansas, and by the way, they were mostly Christians at the time, from Syria. At the time, it was called Syria, in the late 1800s, early 1900. So they labeled themselves as Syrians. There was no Lebanon then. So after World War I, the southwestern region in Syria became Lebanon. And so why did they come here? They come here to escape the Ottoman Empire occupation, which was very hard on Christians and Jews. And so how did they come? They came one at a time to explore the country of the land of opportunity, which is the US. They came through Ellis Islands, registered. Sometimes their names were not registered correctly because they didn't speak English. Fascinating stories we heard from these individuals. Now we are talking third generation, fourth generation, people that came from these families. So at the time, in the 1800s, you would call them immigrant entrepreneurs. Now, because they've been here for a while, now they're considered ethnic entrepreneurs. Now, like Jay said, the first entrepreneur was a peddler. What is a peddler? Somebody who carries a bag with different items in it and goes door to door to sell it. Can you imagine how hard that would be for an immigrant to do that? They understood business opportunity. They identified the business opportunity and they went after it. And then as they made more money in the business, they hired more people on their team. They bought a nicer cart. They moved and became a grocery store or a dry goods store. So business was in their blood. And definitely, if we click to the terms, it will be opportunity entrepreneur. They were not necessity entrepreneurs at all. So what were some of their critical success factors that we found? Family. Family and extended family. I mean, their families were cousins, uncles, aunts, mother, grandmother. They were all in the business. They would convene on a Sunday and eat a meal together and discuss both family and business. What are we going to do next? If they bought a bike for one of the children, they bought a bike for everyone. That was a family decision. So it was fascinating to see brothers and uncles working together. So that was one success factor. Money, where did they get their capital? They borrowed from family. Banks were not going to give them any money, so they borrowed from family. They mostly started in the Delano district, and then they started branching out, going to different places. Assimilation was very swift for the Lebanese, very swift. Immediately, they took English names. They said, we're Americans. They don't even now refer to themselves as Lebanese. They say, we're Americans. But back then, obviously, they immigrated from Lebanon. Many instances exist where the sons, the daughter took over the business, the family business. And so it ran in the family. If you're kids, you always worked in the family business. So at a young age, you can deliver goods, you can do this, and as you grow, you're growing in the family business. So definitely the Lebanese identity is clear when it comes to entrepreneurship. My favorite one was the interview we did with Fran Jabara, who passed away now, and he decided to teach accounting. He studied accounting and came to WSU to teach accounting. And then one summer, he approached the dean of the college and he said, "Can I teach a class on entrepreneurship?" And the dean said, "Sure, go for it." And how many people signed up for that class? 550 people signed up for the class. And it was a summer class. It was not in a regular semester. I think my dean would be very happy if I teach a 500 class, but I'm not going to. After that, it was 300 and 400, a very large class on entrepreneurship. Who was in the first class? Dan Carney from Pizza Hut. And so these stories are interrelated, very much dependent on networks of connections. And I'll turn it to Jay so he can tell you more.
Thank you, Sue. I think part of it, again, to bridge on identity, one of the things we definitely found was that the families, certainly in the Lebanese experience, identified as entrepreneurs and indeed embraced it as a hobby. I mean, there was a sense that as individuals retired, they didn't go to play golf and garden. They engaged in real estate. That was there was a creative outlet. And the more we realized that so many of these entrepreneurial families saw entrepreneurship as a creative outlet, something exciting and dynamic, that permeated the experience. Now, minority entrepreneurship has different experiences and different takeaways. I've worked recently with a project documenting the African American community here in Wichita, working with Robert Weems and the Kansas African American Museum. And here the story is a little more complicated for a couple of reasons. Segregation was a huge issue in the African American experience in Wichita. African Americans were restricted to where they could practice, where they could be, and so forth. Interviewing Charles McAfee, the architect, when he tried to get started and a firm wanted to hire him and he wanted to get going, but then they said, okay, well, we make our contacts at the Wichita Country Club, which was segregated. He couldn't go to the Wichita Country Club to make the business contacts. How do you make a business contact in that type of a situation? Or we learn that the entrepreneurship experience for African Americans will shape itself in some unique ways. One trend that I noticed were a striking number of veterinarians, and as the son of a veterinarian, that got my attention. Why were there so many African American veterinarians in the early part of the 20th century? Well, part of it was the segregation of medical schools and hospitals, and that if you weren't allowed to go to medical school or you're restricted in what you could do in medicine, veterinary medicine offered more opportunities, and that doesn't change until the 1970s with integration and greater integration in the healthcare industry. So those sorts of patterns are there. We also noticed that unlike the large extended families that characterized, say, the Lebanese or the Jewish experiences, here we have isolated individuals who may not have the same level of capitalization or the ability to recover from economic downturns. We found with the Lebanese that if someone underwent a reversal in their business, well, you work with your uncle who has the business down the road. African Americans didn't have that same level of flexibility. And so those are features that you need to keep in mind. So some of the takeaways: we need more research. We need to do a lot more research in the differences. We can't just lump ethnic or minority entrepreneurs into a category that each experience is different. And so there are many, many stories. And they're continuing to change. We're now seeing, well, how do these models play out with Southeast Asians, with Latinos, with migration from Mexico? And we're starting to look at, for example, this is from the journal El Perico. Marco Alcocer has been working on documenting this. He noticed that Mexico makes the second largest export market of Kansas. Once again, it's an immigrant story, but it's a transnational story at the same time. The other thing to keep in mind, this has always been part of our story. And if we broaden our discussion of entrepreneurship beyond the classic entrepreneurial case studies, as great as they are, we get a more nuanced and perhaps more useful picture of what entrepreneurship is like and how it is developing and where it's going. One aspect of this is a project that Sue and I are working on with KMUW, partnering with WSU and KMUW to document the story of different types of entrepreneurs. And so here's the Wichita Entrepreneurship webpage. Go to kmuw.org. You'll be able to click on these. You'll be able to click on the photo. You'll get the story, in this case, of Carney and Pizza Hut. But if you click on the picture below, you'll get the story of Charles McAfee as an African-American architect functioning as a professional, as an entrepreneur in Wichita with opportunities and constraints. There are more coming. In fact, I just got the emails from KMUW that a few are going to be coming up very, very soon. So with that, I think we turn it over to the group.